Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for taking some time this afternoon to check in with us on the Flagstaff Regional Plan. This is the fifth technical advisory group meeting, and we have some exciting developments to share with you. We've got some public feedback on the growth ideas that we discussed last time, and we have some preliminary ideas for scenarios that we want to run by you. We have 2 hours for today's meeting, but it's possible we may not need that entire 2 hours just based on what we have planned. So if that's the case, we'll just let you leave a little bit earlier and give you some of your afternoon back. But before we get into that, just a quick overview of the agenda. We'll do a little bit of meeting logistics, just like we always do. And then we'll get into a presentation and discussion. So we'll sort of weave those two together on some recent public input that was received on the growth ideas that we talked about in the last meeting. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time talking about those draft scenario themes that we've developed to get feedback from you on whether you think those are hitting the mark. And we'll wrap up by talking about some of the next steps and give a little preview for late summer, early fall in this project. Sarah, would you like to do the land acknowledgement today?
Happy to. The city of Flagstaff humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of this area's indigenous nations and original stewards. These lands, still inhabited by native descendants, border mountains sacred to indigenous peoples. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home.
Apologies there. So just a brief overview of the TAG purpose and approach. The Technical Advisory Group's purpose is to advise the city and county staff and the consulting team on the assumptions, data, and methods appropriate to engaging the community through scenario planning to ensure for a resilient and equitable future in the Flagstaff region. No quorum is required, but every TAG member is important and invited for a reason. Staff is committed to transparency and open dialogue in this process, and staff not attending these meetings and the public will have robust opportunities to participate and understand the scenario planning process. Transparency and public engagement. In between meetings of the TAG, staff and the public may be asked to weigh in on outstanding questions and topics of interest, and you'll see some of that today. Staff will compile and share this feedback with the TAG regularly. The public will be able to watch and comment on meetings asynchronously. After the introductions, the meeting recording will start. We've actually jumped the gun a bit today and started it already. And it will be posted to the city website by the end of the week, usually with a feedback form. Meeting agendas will be posted to the website without the meeting link. We want to ensure that everyone on the TAG has adequate airtime, the ability to speak openly and listen respectfully. And meeting agreements. We consider both and we don't debate to win. Be mindful, be aware of your privileges and notice power dynamics in the room. Show respect, participate and stay present. Eliminate distractions. Allow space for exploration and trust that others are in their own process at their own pace. And please use the chat, in particular today, because there'll be a lot of information, to pose a question or comment. Use Q or C at the beginning of your message to indicate whether it is a question or a comment. For example, Q, what are drivers of change? But you should all know what those are at this point. But there will be, I'm sure, additional questions. So with that, we are going to get into a presentation and discussion on recent public input that we received on growth principles. Before we do that, though, we do have a meme that was made right here in Flagstaff to share with you today that's relevant to what we're going to be doing. But I have to come clean. I've not yet seen the Barbie movie, and I know it's a real sin to say. But Sarah, maybe if you can help give us an overview of what's going on here.
So, we've been on, this is the fifth meeting we've had since March, the TAG, and you have all helped us develop vision state in terms of how to make this process go forward, helped us with identifying the issues that we took into the public meetings, help us evaluate what is in the public meetings. And now it's Birkenstocks or stilettos. We need to make some decisions about what alternatives we evaluate and present going forward with the public. And so to advertise your meetings, the video publication, we've made this little meme up. It was actually a challenge from the communication staff to come up with something really current and catchy to describe what the tag has been up to. So I'll take feedback on my social media skills in addition to encouraging you to think that we're at the weird Barbie phase where we've cut up a lot of things, we've drawn on stuff. We really at this point have to shape it up in a way that makes choices available to the community in a way that maybe they don't like, maybe they wish they could pick stilettos and we can't have stilettos, but hopefully we can help everyone get on board and understand. So I figured there was Barbie was in this movie, at least was a fairly good planner.
So does this mean we're about to cross over into the real world?
Are we? You're the modeler. You have to tell us.
I hope we do. Yeah, that's the idea. We've got to test this stuff out, right? So okay. So with that, a little bit of a refresher on where we landed last time. So the last meeting we talked about growth ideas and growth principles. Growth ideas are specific concepts for where future growth could occur. And a growth principle are general values and a vision carried forward from the regional planning efforts last time and from some of the visioning workshops that were done early in the process that inform how growth could happen. And we are headed toward some actual modeled scenarios that show how those things could play out in the future. But so that we're sure we're really getting those right, we want to start with a more conceptual understanding of what these scenarios are going to be. And that's what scenario themes are. They are a draft version of a scenario that describes a concept for future growth informed by both growth ideas and growth principles. And we're going to hopefully get some feedback from you today. There'll be a few other rounds of feedback from city staff and others. But we're narrowing in on actually starting to do the modeling, but want to make sure we have this right before we do. So before we get into those scenario themes, we wanted to share with you some feedback that was recently received from several public engagement events and a survey on our growth ideas. I'm not sure why these are all showing up as number one, but there are 6 of them. And just to refresh your memory, they are adding more density in rural activity centers, urbanizing larger greenfield sites within the city of Flagstaff, really focusing in on downtown and NAU and trying to build additional density there, focusing on East Flagstaff and corridors in that area, prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards, and attracting large employers. So I'm going to go through 6 slides that each summarize the reasons why the public said they might be interested in a growth idea and some of their concerns associated with each growth idea. And I thought we could try to reflect on those a little bit as we go through. So on the topic of rural activity centers, the folks who were engaged with this question said they were intrigued because they thought it would support employment and access to goods and services in these areas, and that it may help improve connectivity and transportation options within and to and from these areas. This is pretty similar to a lot of what we heard during the Face the Future workshops. So it's interesting to see that come up again. But there were a number of concerns as well. Concern about expanding into the wildland urban interface, which is the area that's most prone to fire near where the city is currently. Conflict with limiting expansion into natural areas. Concerns about natural hazards, so those are kind of related. Concerns about sprawl and how this could feed into a more sprawly growth pattern. Higher resource use per capita, so that we'd be basically using more energy, using more water, driving more. Uncertain impacts on driving behavior and carbon neutrality. So could this potentially take us further away from our carbon neutrality goals? There's the cost issue, which many of us discussed in the last meeting, that getting more density in these areas without a lot of infrastructure would cost a lot in terms of adding that infrastructure. And then neighborhood opposition and concerns about loss of rural character in some of these areas. Does anyone have any thoughts they'd like to add to this? Does this seem consistent with the conversations that we've had as a group up to this point? We can come back to this, or if someone has a thought on this, feel free to throw it into the chat. The second growth idea was urbanized Flagstaff greenfield sites. So the public was intrigued by the idea because they thought it could decentralize downtown Flagstaff, and that there was an opportunity for high quality mixed use and smart growth centered development. So the idea of maybe creating multiple downtowns, for instance. Concerns included preferences to see open spaces incorporated into greenfield development, concern about developing too much of our greenfield sites so that it impacts quality of life, loss of forests, loss of view sheds. Again, this concern about sprawl pops up here. Uncertain impacts on things like resource use and carbon neutrality also pops up here, and then natural hazards. So some of the same concerns that we saw in the rural activity center focused growth idea are popping up here in the urbanized Flagstaff greenfield sites idea. The third growth idea is focus on downtown and NAU. On the intrigued side, the public said that they liked that it would limit the city's footprint and impact on the wildland urban interface, that it would preserve natural areas, potentially lower resource use and support carbon neutrality, support multimodal transportation, provide opportunities for some reinvestment in some areas, make more efficient use of infrastructure, and just generally be more cost effective. But the concerns were traffic congestion, particularly in downtown, viewshed impacts with larger buildings, loss of small town character, community concerns about density and how that may limit the effectiveness of some of these policies because they weren't sure that there was actual demand for that. Displacement of existing residents, and then general concern about growth in town. So very different set of concerns, kind of the polar opposite of the previous two. Interesting to see the displacement concern there with the downtown and NAU focused scenario or growth idea. Focus on East Flagstaff. The public was intrigued by the idea, again, of decentralization of downtown Flagstaff, that multiple downtown idea. They liked that it could potentially also limit the city's footprint and help preserve natural areas and allow us to be more efficient and maybe support carbon neutrality and multimodal transportation. So similar to that NAU and downtown growth idea. Concerns were, again, traffic congestion, again, displacement of existing residents, which I think many of us had already discussed as a potential concern with focusing growth in this area, and then a loss of character. Prioritize conservation and avoid hazards. People were generally intrigued by this. Pretty broad support. The idea of helping to preserve natural areas and reducing pressure on areas that might burn or flood was, you saw that in other growth ideas, and this one it was only more apparent. And they thought there was an opportunity to include indigenous perspectives and recognition of sacred grounds, which is kind of an interesting angle on this growth idea that I don't think we had fully considered. They were concerned that there isn't a mention of indigenous perspectives in this one right now, that it's solely focused on ecological value and not culture and history of indigenous populations. And finally, attract large employers, general support for more employment options and better wages, but not that much about specifically where that might be a good idea or what sorts of jobs would be most most needed. There was some concern about housing supply to support job growth. So if there's a bunch more jobs, a bunch of people moving to Flagstaff, that puts even more pressure on the existing housing supply. Preference for local businesses and concern about negatively impacting them. So if a bunch of large employers come in, will they compete with more legacy small businesses? And then concern about large employer fit with the local community. So is the are the space needs, are the culture of the company going to fit in with the local community? Go ahead, Sarah.
There's a couple of questions for you, Steiny, in the chat. If you got a second, this seems like a good place to pause
Yeah,
for those.
absolutely.
So the first one is Julie wanted to understand better why decentralization was considered appealing. I think that was maybe on the downtown NAU slide. Is that correct, Julie?
It came up both in the urbanized greenfield sites and in the East Flagstaff. So it's kind of it's a feature that isn't part of the downtown and NAU growth idea, because that one focuses really exclusively on downtown. But it seemed like they liked the opportunity for downtown-like activity in these two places. But maybe Jordan or Sarah can help fill in the gaps there.
Yeah, I think that there is some impression that in some parts of town that downtown isn't for them. And that having other places, other activity centers besides downtown and investing in them, it was an intriguing process. Julie, do you have any other follow-ups you want to do before we move on to the next comment?
I guess related to activity centers, downtown Flagstaff is unique because it's got the historic character, and there are things about it as an activity center that even if we are to identify other activity centers in these growth models, they probably don't look like downtown Flagstaff. So when we talk about decentralization of downtown Flagstaff, what are those specific things in this activity center that folks are looking for in other activity centers? And is that possible?
That's a great question.
Thanks.
And then
That's it.
thanks,
Great.
Julie.
And then Tyler had a comment that it wasn't clear to have had development in the downtown worsens traffic congestion compared to other growth areas, because residents in the downtown drive less and are less likely to own a vehicle. Do you want to address that just in general, Steiny, from what you saw in the comments?
Yeah, I think there's a public perception that tall buildings equal traffic, and it's as many of us know, it's a more complicated interrelationship of land use and transportation than just that. And I think part of the communication of scenarios to the public is showing them that maybe a scenario that features that growth idea, the downtown and NAU growth idea more heavily, actually results in less driving. So I think it's not all that surprising to hear, but we can, through the scenarios, help combat that conception. Tyler, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
And hi, everyone. This is Kim, and I wanted to address the concern about the decentralization of downtown Flagstaff and what that would look like. What that concern went towards is that there are other places that are historic in Flagstaff, and the people that want to decentralize downtown Flagstaff, it's not a matter of making it look like downtown Flagstaff, but there are other places in this city where there are several locally owned small businesses within a 1 mile radius. So on 4th Street, I believe there was a focus on Main Street money, perhaps going towards 4th Street, and I could be wrong about that. But there was a focus on developing 4th Street so it becomes a downtown-like area. I've seen this done also in Albuquerque when there is a junction or a certain place where you have a high density of locally owned and large businesses that give a downtown like feel where you can park in one place and then walk the area. The issue is that with downtown Flagstaff, there are other businesses, but the money is not put towards these other neighborhoods where a feel of a downtown area could be. So on 4th Street, Sunnyside, Southside neighborhoods, you have a lot of locally owned small businesses that are right next to each other, boom, boom, boom. But the focus is not on those businesses. The focus isn't on holding the landlords accountable for how their buildings look. There's not a business alliance, so to speak. There is the Sunnyside Neighborhood Association, the Southside Community Association, and the Live Black Experience Project. And there are neighborhood associations that invest in those neighborhoods, but what we cannot do is hold the landlord's feet to the fire to say, hey y'all, we can put money in this, but landlords, you got to bring your buildings up to code. Y'all got to be in this with us. So we're not looking for the same look of downtown Flagstaff. We're looking for a similarly walkable area that focuses on small locally owned businesses. Over.
Thank you, Kim. That's great. And I think as we present the scenario themes to you today, I want to come back to Kim's comment and make sure that that vision for 4th Street and other areas of East Flagstaff is showing up in at least one of our scenarios, because I think that's really important. I just want to mention here that Jenny says that the Santa Fe rail yard development could be a good comparison. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. We can take a look at that and see if we can try to replicate that in one of the scenarios. Any other thoughts about what we've just heard about what the public's saying about these growth ideas? Okay. So our next portion of the presentation today is going to be a discussion of draft scenario themes. And I'll say that there's still a good amount of flexibility in these. They are not fully decided on yet. And so we'd really like your help today refining them further. And without bearing the lead any longer, here are the 4 scenario themes that we're thinking of exploring. And so I will read these to you. They're not too long, so bear with me. We have scenarios A, B, C, and D. Scenario A is business as usual. This one's kind of already set. We've already created a draft of this, and it's really based on past trends. So there's not much that we would propose changing about it, but I'll just read it so that we can see where it lands relative to the others. So in business as usual, development patterns and growth follow recent trends with relatively low density single family development throughout much of the city, but higher densities in downtown and around NAU. New jobs and housing occur in Belmont, kind of getting at the Belmont area plan's desire to see more industrial uses, and then around the airport and Fort Tuthill. In scenario B, which we're calling complete communities, we see moderate growth occurring outside of the central city, outside of downtown, by adding housing and jobs to greenfield development sites in rural and suburban activity centers. These areas receive new roads, water, and sewer lines to facilitate this development. So you can see in this one, we're bringing in some of those growth ideas around greenfield sites and rural activity centers. Scenario C, we're calling urban centers and corridors. Development is focused in downtown and along major corridors like Route 66, Milton Road, and 4th Street at higher densities than exist today. More concentrated development allows for improved transit service and safer options for walking and biking in areas where growth is occurring. And then in scenario D, which we're calling neighborhood infill, more compact housing types such as accessory dwelling units, duplexes, townhomes, and quadplexes are woven into existing residential areas, expanding housing options and affordability throughout the region. So those are our four scenario themes, and we'll get into more detail about each of those. But also wanted to share with you how the 6 growth ideas that we discussed previously factor into each of those scenarios. You can see the business as usual scenario. It does address rural activity centers, urbanizing greenfield sites, and downtown. It kind of spreads everything around, and also does a little bit of attracting large employers. But it doesn't really bring in any of the focus on East Flagstaff growth idea, and it doesn't intentionally do much to preserve or to prioritize conservation and avoid hazards any more than has been done previously. In scenario B, it really tries to max out the idea of rural activity centers and urbanizing Flagstaff greenfield sites. It's much less focused on downtown and less focused on prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards. It also focuses quite a bit on the idea of attracting large employers. So the idea here is we have these larger sites. They'll need infrastructure, certainly, but we're going to focus on providing that infrastructure over providing it elsewhere and try to make them as dense and mixed use as we can. We had some discussions about this one, and there was some pushback in our last tag meeting from certain folks around the idea of adding substantially more development in rural activity centers, because there just really is not the capacity to do that. There's not there, and a lot of the concerns we heard from the public ring true here. There's not the desire from local residents for that sort of intensity. There isn't infrastructure to support that intensity, and to add that infrastructure would be prohibitively expensive. And it really clashes with our regional value, really important regional value of prioritizing conservation. So our thinking with scenario B was that we would scale back a little bit the amount of development we assume can happen in rural activity centers, and combine that with the idea of maximizing the mixed use and intensity in the urbanized or in the Flagstaff greenfield sites that are a little bit more feasible to serve with infrastructure. Scenario C is really focused on downtown and NAU, and it's really focused on prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards. In the last tag meeting, we talked about how these two ideas are really hand in glove, because if you focus in downtown, you build at higher densities, you need less land, and there's less pressure on those areas that have hazards or ecologically valuable land. And then in the neighborhood infill scenario, that's the one where we focus most on East Flagstaff. And what's not represented here is that there'd also be a pretty substantial focus on some of the neighborhoods that surround downtown, because those are the areas where sort of that middle density housing, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes would probably make the most sense. Any questions on this so far? Comments, thoughts? Okay, as things come up, feel free to throw them in the chat and we can address them. We'll have, as I said, more of a chance to go through each one of these and get more feedback. Looks like Tyler has a question.
Yeah, I've got a question on the scenario D, the neighborhood infill. I've heard some mixed things. Aren't duplexes and some of that missing middle housing, isn't that mostly legal, even in neighborhoods that are nominally single family? I just feel like I'm a little bit confused, and I've heard different things about whether like up to duplexes, triplexes are already legal in Flagstaff in most places.
Sarah, can you speak to that at all? Or anyone else from city staff?
I'm just looking and see if Michelle's here and wants to chime in on that. I can speak to it a little bit if she's not available to unmic and answer the question. It is my understanding that duplexes are allowed in all R1 zoning. They're not allowed, I think, in ER. Let me look at what I had here the other day. I was looking at it. I think we have some residential zones where I think you can have a single family home and an ADU, but maybe not a duplex. I have to get back to you with some of that, but I think the most common low density residential zone is our R1 and R1N. Go ahead.
Sarah, this is Genevieve. I can jump in whenever you want.
Go ahead, Genevieve.
So we have the plain residential development option. And so that allows for a little bit more flexibility in terms of housing types. So it is correct that all of the residential zones, including ER and RR, allow duplexes. For triplexes, those are allowed in MR and HR. So MR and HR allow a lot more of the housing types that are allowed in the planned residential development standards currently, but duplexes are allowed in all of the single family zones.
And Genevieve, can I just clarify too? This is Jenny, folks. Hi. Aren't they allowed, but your lot has to be fairly large? So in effect, it doesn't really matter. That's how I understand it, is it's based on the density, and most lots cannot actually have a duplex because they're too small.
Yeah, that's a good question. So they have to meet, when you do the planned residential development, you have to meet certain building form standards. So I don't know if it's necessarily cut and dry exactly how you said it, but I do think that definitely plays out, that that does come into play sometimes in terms of the lot size impacting what can actually fit on the lot.
Yeah. And I think I would just say too, Tyler, to your point, I think we'd see them more if they were like easily legal.
So this is a big deal that you've just all hit on. It's the difference between allowing something and encouraging it. And it's possible that some of the zones allow a pathway to a duplex right now in some conditions, but certain things like setbacks, lot coverage, parking could get in the way. And I think the idea with this scenario is that there would be additional housing options beyond a duplex. You might even consider a fourplex with 2 ADUs, or a sixplex, or an eightplex. And in those situations, zoning today certainly does not allow that. And there are other things that are part of zoning, like parking and height and bulk standards and setbacks and those sorts of things, that are going to prohibit that kind of outcome unless you're really intentional about reforming your code to allow it. So I think there's like a deeper set of questions there that we can dig into with this scenario. Like, do you want to not just say yes, you can build 4 units, but actually go further and say, yeah, maybe we want to remove parking requirements. Maybe we want to waive impact fees for those types of developments. So I think there's a lot that this scenario that would be required on the policy side to change in order to make this scenario happen. And that's why I think it's an interesting scenario to go through to see if the public likes the outcome.
And another thing, Steiny, that Melissa Shaw put in the chat, that while all zones in the county allow accessory dwelling units, duplexes are not allowed in all of the county zones. And remember that there's county infill parcels in the city as well. Like there's little islands and places where that could make a difference.
Hey, and Sarah, I just wanted to clarify too, I'm just toggling through different parts of the zoning code, that multifamily is also allowed in some of the other residential zones, but it's either through a use permit or through that planned residential development, and then you have specific building types. So I still think that brings up the conversation of, is it allowed, but is it very easy to do at this point? But just wanted to clarify that in the zoning code.
Yeah, and as you said, some multifamily it's not like a come in and just get your building permit kind of approval right now. So if we loosen those standards, which there are some cities that are making everything up to a fourplex permitted by right everywhere. That is a policy that other cities in the Western United States, in the Northeast, in the Midwest are considering. And so that could be a type of neighborhood infill that through this exploratory scenario planning, we can get an idea of, is that an idea that has merit in Flagstaff, or is there a reason that our urban form and design doesn't support the community taking that step? Is that a good, I know that was a long answer, Tyler, because we were trying to look things up while we were talking as a team, but is that helpful?
No, yeah, that was very helpful. And it does explain some of the mixed messages I heard on it. So I really appreciate the response and explaining the complexity behind it.
So next I want to talk about how we're thinking transportation investments will differ from one scenario to the next. And the way we're thinking about this is in terms of regional investments and City of Flagstaff investments. And for the City of Flagstaff, the main document that we're paying attention to is the Active Transportation Master Plan. And at the regional level, it's the recently released Stride Forward Regional Transportation Plan that MetroPlan produced. And on the regional side of things, we're looking at two investment scenarios that they included within the Stride Forward plan. There's the onward scenario, which is fiscally constrained, meaning that there is enough money in the revenue that the region gets from the federal government to actually pay for all of these things within the time period that's covered by the plan. And as MetroPlan summarizes it, it maintains the status quo. It implements some of the local propositions that were passed recently, 403, 419, and 420, which deal with, I believe, keeping roads in state of good repair. There was a transit prop that did not pass, and that is not included in the onward plan because it didn't pass, and so that funding is not available. And the results based on their modeling, and we're going to align our modeling with theirs a little bit, is that VMT would increase quite a bit if the region, if this was the package of investments that the region stuck to. I'm going to get to Michelle's comment in just a minute here, but it's just to finish this up. On the other side of things, they also did sort of a very open-ended look at what would it take to maybe get closer to meeting the region's carbon neutrality goals. And so they came up with a scenario that really ratchets up the investments in public transportation, bicycling, and walking. It's not fiscally constrained, so there isn't money to actually do it right now. But they wanted to see what would happen if somehow there were. And so for us, this sets up an interesting spectrum. It's like you can be all the way on the one side, the fiscally constrained status quo end of things, or we could test some scenarios that through some series of policy actions get us closer to that upward scenario. And I'll mention a couple of other upward scenario things that onward does not include. It would require electric vehicle charging in all new developments. It would provide incentives for electric vehicles, double transit service by 2030, and quadruple bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure by 2030. And then it would also extend transit service to underserved and unserved communities. So pretty aggressive, pretty conceptual, right? We may not go all the way in this direction in any scenario, but it is helpful because it does give us a chance to test out, what if we were able to get a hold of some additional funding to check some of these things off of our wish list. And pivoting here to Michelle's question or comment to Tyler, The zoning code manager, Tiffany Antle, can have a much more in-depth discussion with you on that topic and some of the changes we currently have going to help resolve conflicts. Thank you, Michelle, for that. Any questions about how we're thinking about the Stride Forward Regional Transportation Plan in these scenarios? Okay, I'm going to keep going. On the City of Flagstaff side, we're looking at the Flagstaff Active Transportation Master Plan. And in that plan, transportation investments are prioritized into first, second, third, and fourth priority. And right now, most but not all projects in the first priority category are funded. And so we want to assume that those projects get built in all of the scenarios. But the second, third, and fourth priority projects are kind of an open question. There would need to be additional funding sources or some sort of a local bond that would have to be passed to get those funded. And we want to leave the possibility open for that in some of these scenarios. And so we're testing, where our idea is to test scenarios that include some of these second, third, and fourth priority projects specific to the areas where growth is occurring. So in a scenario where growth's occurring in suburban activity centers, those are the second through fourth tier projects that would get built. And in a scenario that's focused on just downtown or downtown and East Flagstaff, those would be the areas that get prioritized. So that's the way we're thinking about local transportation projects in the scenarios. So we just talked about transportation. One more opportunity here before we move into each individual scenario. Any other questions or comments about how we're treating transportation? All right. So next, we're going to dive into each scenario individually and look at some more detailed assumptions about what we're planning to model. This is still pretty high level stuff, but it gives you a little bit more of a view into what these scenarios are made of. So scenario A, business as usual. Like we said, it follows past trends. Rural and suburban activity centers continue to grow at relatively low densities. Student housing growth continues in and around downtown and NAU. Belmont adds additional employment. Expansion of jobs around the Woody Mountain Purple Sage area. And roughly 70% of new housing units are single-family homes, half of which are on lots larger than 1 acre. A pretty good share of larger homes. In terms of where development occurs and what that looks like, in urban activity centers, we're thinking kind of status quo, a little bit of mixed use up to 6 stories, which is what the maximum kind of height and intensity has been up until now. As well as some 3 to 4 story apartments. In suburban activity centers, we would build out existing subdivisions and some new subdivisions with a little bit of multifamily in the John Wesley Powell area would get built. In rural activity centers, we would build out all the vacant sites remaining in the unincorporated communities, and then there'd be some employment growth in Belmont and minimal change in established neighborhoods. And then in terms of transportation investments, we would assume the onward investment package. So the things that are funded in the most recent regional transportation plan, and then only the first priority active transportation master plan projects would get funded in this scenario. And we would shoot for a housing mix of 70% single family, 15% attached housing, and 15% multifamily housing. In terms of the type of housing growth, I alluded to this a little bit, but in the urban activity centers, it's going to be a mix of some mid-rise mixed use and low-rise multifamily. In suburban activity centers, large lot homes, small lot homes, and low-rise multifamily. And in rural activity centers, larger acreage homes on vacant sites. And where employment growth occurs is mostly going to be in downtown and around the airport and Fort Tuthill areas, as well as around the east and west Route 66 gateways into town and around Belmont in the industrial lands over there. So that's the business as usual scenario. As I mentioned, we have a draft of this already, and it's been vetted to some degree by staff. So we're not anticipating too much change with this one. In terms of scenario B, in this one, additional employment and moderate growth occurs in rural areas and greenfield sites. Additional jobs in Belmont and Donny Park and around the Woody Mountain Purple Sage area and the airport. More complete mixed-use communities are created by extending infrastructure like roads, water, and sewer lines. Local services, amenities, and a small amount of multifamily housing are added to rural activity centers, bringing additional uses into the region's rural communities. And undeveloped sites within the urban service boundary are developed at higher densities. Most new homes are on smaller lots than in scenario A, so it's a little bit more compact. In urban activity centers, it's kind of the same deal as in scenario A. The difference is really in the suburban activity centers. Here, we would build out existing entitled subdivisions. And then in the new subdivisions that aren't currently entitled, it would be a mix of large lot and mixed use large lot single family and then multifamily in those areas. In the rural activity centers, it looks pretty similar to scenario A. But a little bit more employment growth in Donny Park as well as Belmont. In terms of transportation investments, we would focus on the onward investment package plus the upward projects that serve suburban activity centers. So we would cherry pick out those projects in the unfunded category that apply where the growth is happening. Similarly, with the active transportation master plan, we would focus on those first priority projects and then the second through fourth priority projects serving suburban activity centers. And finally, in terms of housing mix, 65% single family, 5% attached, and 30% multifamily. It's a little less single family, a little more multifamily, a little less attached than scenario A. And looking at that a different way, urban activity center growth looks pretty similar to scenario A, 6 stories, and then 3 to 4 story multifamily. In suburban activity centers, it's a little more varied. There's more small lot homes, mixed use, less than 6 stories, and low rise multifamily. So it gets a little more intense. And then in the rural activity centers, there'd be a greater mix of single family and even a little bit of low rise multifamily and a little bit of mixed use because it's actually allowed in some zones in some of those unincorporated communities. And then in terms of where employment growth happens, it's less in downtown, more around the airport and Fort Tuthill, more around the western gateway of downtown, and more around Belmont. I want to pause here because we're halfway through these scenario descriptions. We've looked at scenario A and scenario B. Any questions or comments about what I've presented so far? Okay, feel free to use the chat if you have a question or comment. Scenario C, this is the one we're calling urban centers and corridors. You can see those purple urban activity center bubbles are bigger in this one. Downtown and neighboring districts experience redevelopment, including additional possibilities for living and working in around urban centers and corridors at higher densities than exist today. Mixed-use buildings are built alongside multifamily housing, jobs, and services. Development increases along major corridors like Route 66 and Milton Road. Transit service and safer options for walking and biking are expanded in areas where growth is occurring. This scenario seeks to maximize the potential for workforce and affordable housing development in downtown Flagstaff and surrounding areas. Some of the highlights here in terms of where growth is happening, the urban activity centers, we're thinking here that we may want to test out buildings that are taller than what's been built in the recent past, so going above 6 stories. We know that there is definitely some opposition to that we've heard, but there's also some support for that. And we figured if we were really going to try to create a scenario that tries to maximize downtown's potential to capture growth within the region, that would be the way to do it, is to try to test out some more intense zoning that would allow for larger buildings. We also have those 3 to 4 story apartments in there. And then in the suburban activity centers, there's a little less activity there than in scenario B, although there is still a mix of housing types. Probably the least activity in the rural activity centers in this scenario. And then in the established neighborhood, there'd be some neighborhood infill in the form of duplexes and ADUs. So the things that are already legal, but that we're not really seeing that much of today. And then in terms of the transportation investments here, we're thinking about testing kind of all the way to the upward investment package from the regional transportation plan. So that would be a quadrupling of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, a doubling of transit infrastructure. And then in the city of Flagstaff investments, it would be the first priority projects from the active transportation master plan, and then the lesser priority improvements serving urban activity centers. So we would cherry pick out those ones that are focused on where the growth's happening. The most multifamily of any scenario, 35%, 10% attached housing, and the least single family of any scenario at 55%. I want to highlight Sarah's question here, chiming in about the 6+ story buildings. So a couple of comments here. Paul says there would certainly be resistance. Yeah, we've heard that. And I don't think the purpose for each scenario is to be, there are going to be scenarios that certain groups of people really dislike and certain scenarios that others like. And I think that's part of what makes this conversation interesting when we have it. Julie asks, oh, go ahead.
People are adding a lot in the chat that I think they should feel free to unmute and share if they like. We have a couple of taller buildings. We'll be seeing if we are going to have, a tall building with the in the future that's up for a referendum this fall. Are we at a point where we need to understand, remembering this is exploratory scenario planning, are we at a point where we need to understand what the benefits or maybe what the, changes we may experience if we start to see 7, 8 story buildings in and around central Flagstaff? I think we can all imagine we're going to hear the against side being the view sheds and, out of character development. But I think there are affordable housing advocates who say it's time to get a little taller so we can manage our land supply. And I think there are also people we've heard from who are kind of, reading strong towns and, like urbanization in some ways because they think it makes a more walkable community and can also support transit. So I think there are people on all sides of the issue. There are certainly people with very strong feelings against having anything over 6 stories in Flagstaff who speak very strongly in the comments that we have been getting. We're trying to remember that we're trying to create a breadth of ideas that we've explored through the modeling that Steiny and Rachel are going to be pulling together. And is it broad enough to understand what kind of changes the community could experience and what we should be encouraging in our future, phase of development as a community? Yeah, there's some comments about how NAU has had buildings over 6 stories for a long time. Yeah, David Carpenter pointed out the community can always, say they don't want buildings over 6 story just by that scenario being presented. We're not going to be presenting scenarios as anything that's endorsed at the scenario choosing phase, just as things we're trying to understand.
Yeah,
go ahead,
Steiny.
Sarah.
I was just going to mention that the city is also undertaking a review of land availability and the code. And this is a really well-timed kind of a question, because if there's broad support from the community for a scenario that includes more intense development than the code currently allows, that's a very interesting finding for the city as they're going into that process. And similarly, if there's a really strong aversion to that scenario, that is also super helpful for that process. So I think this is a good question for right now. Even if it ends up being a non-starter for folks, that's super helpful information for that work that's happening in parallel. And there will be some visualization of these scenarios. Remember that. That's maybe we haven't discussed that much, but there is some scope for us and the city to produce some visuals associated with this. And that'll be really telling too. If we can produce this, if we can model this scenario and show that it does have some benefits, like it helps us get closer to our carbon neutrality goals, or reduces VMT and greenhouse gas emissions, or it produces more affordable housing. If we can put that alongside an image of what might it actually look like, that gives people some pretty good information to turn around and tell us, yeah, I'm into that, or no, I do not like that at all, even with all the benefits that it comes with. And that's very, very helpful information. Some other comments have come in.
Will we
Oh,
be
go ahead,
able
Sarah.
to tease out of scenario C what it's like with and without buildings over 6 stories?
Not easily, no.
Yeah.
It's kind of like if we're going there, that's the scenario that we're building. So that
I've
is
seen in
a
the chat, that there's a good portion of the tag that thinks it's worth including in an exploratory fashion and making sure it's framed that way. Not that we're, saying that there's going to be any zoning changes or saying there's going to be anything ahead, but just asking the question, what does that look like in the community? Is there anyone who wants to offer the opposite? Like, does anybody think like it's a waste of time? Like, I want to make sure people are chiming in with all sides of what we're seeing as a group here. Are there some people who think it's a waste of time and it just will push people away from this scenario and decrease engagement? Anything along those lines? I don't know. I'm looking for those who haven't put a note in the chat to chime in. Roxana, you said you think it will actually help engagement. Do you have a why you want to share?
Well, especially if there's a space to see this, to have a visual for this, it gets us into having a conversation around it in terms of just saying yes or no. I think it's really necessary.
One question that I have, it's a little more detailed, and I'm not sure if folks are going to feel like they're equipped to weigh in on it, but if we are including buildings larger than 6 stories in in this scenario, how tall do we think we want to go? I'll throw out that there's hold on, before I get into that, there's some other comments that we probably want to circle back to. So Paul says, is there a chance that including 6+ stories in this results in the public rejecting the urban center scenario? It certainly is a possibility that could be a poison pill for the whole scenario. But I think when you look at it relative to scenario D, there are kind of 2 options there that still result in fairly urban centric scenarios. So it's not like we maybe lose any possibility of the public choosing something that is more compact and maybe a bit better helping us meet our carbon neutrality goals. So it's not that it's the only one. I think the distinction between scenario C and scenario D is scenario C is really focused on increasing the density through very large or much larger, more intense development in less locations, whereas scenario D requires the neighborhoods to experience some of that closer to where they live. And I think that's a really interesting choice too. It's like, do you want density kind of everywhere, or that's not quite as, it's not crazy dense, but it's sort of peanut buttered around all the neighborhoods, or do you want density only in downtown, but it's much denser than what's been built in the past? Lots of comments coming through.
Yeah. So one thing too, and Roxana said she wouldn't go any higher than peer cities. So two of the peer cities we looked at from the high occupancy housing plan were Bozeman, Montana, and Boulder, Colorado, which both had like building heights of like 80 or so last time I checked on those, which was like 2018. And I actually just quickly looked them up, and Bozeman's maximum building height is now 148 feet, and Boulder's is now 158 feet. So since we did our high occupancy housing look at the plan and the code, what was it, 5 years ago, both of those cities have almost doubled their building heights since that time. So maybe that's one of those things we share, is we say, when we looked at peer cities last, we were seeing, 60 to 100 feet was pretty normal, but they're starting to double those numbers, or at least two of them that I could look up in 10 minutes. And so I think that maybe we use it that way. I like that approach, Roxana, of saying, we're not looking at this because we think it's right for Flagstaff, just like any of the other ones, but because we're seeing a trend that other communities that we consider peer cities are starting to look into this. So we're wanting to understand it better. And then I saw Genevieve has a question in the chat where she just put a Q.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I was just wondering, and this may have been in the map, so if I missed this, apologies. But for the established neighborhoods and neighborhood infill in the form of duplexes and ADUs, obviously the neighborhoods that have CC&Rs could have a big impact on that. So I'm assuming that's been taken into account, just since some, the CC&Rs would have to be amended in order to allow some of that stuff. So just so that could have a big impact on the scenarios, in case that hasn't been included so far. Just wanted to draw attention to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So what you're, just for the group, what you're referencing there are bylaws that the city does not have direct control over changing through the code. And so it's
Yes.
very difficult there to enact changes that are specifically regulated within those CC&Rs. And to answer your question, yeah, we're definitely going to take those sorts of things into account. And we are having a meeting with city staff, and I believe also county staff, week after next, to review some of these concepts and point out some of those exact things. Like where is this change actually not likely to be possible given things like CC&Rs or existing entitlements that have been otherwise negotiated, or some environmental constraint that we may not be aware of. So we're trying to inject as much reality into these as we can. So all these concepts will get reined in a little bit through that process. Okay, so I'm hearing look to peer
I'll pull up
cities.
some research, Steiny, on those peer
Yeah.
cities so that we have it when we sit down and actually pull it together. I just made a note to myself to go back and pull some newer, more up-to-date research on building heights in our peer cities.
Great. Yeah, and we'll also be thinking about, this is really in the weeds, but International Building Code specifies the heights at which you can build different types of construction, and that really influences what's actually going to get built in a lot of places, because even though Bozeman may allow 150 feet, no one may actually take advantage of that because it's not financially feasible to do that. And so we'll want to make sure that we're being cognizant of that as well.
Can I echo that point? I mean, I just looked it up. The tallest building in Bozeman's 7 stories. So I mean, that's going to be steel with structured parking, which is just it massively increases the cost of building something like that. So can our local economy support those kind of construction costs?
Right, and there's also a reason why they didn't build a 10-story building, even though they could have based on the height. It may just have been either prohibitively expensive or not advantageous for them to add those 3 stories parking can also be a constraint there. So yeah.
On that
so it's
one's
something we'll
tiny
be-
too. Can I add something that I
Mhm.
want us to remember too? This is that 20-year time horizon. So some of those market conditions can change. Like for instance, we didn't see any 5-story buildings in Flagstaff for 40 years. And then we got 6 of them all at once. So while we'll pay some attention to that, we do want to remember those things. Construction technology also changes, and the cost and availability of supplies will change over 20 years. Hopefully not always in the everything's more expensive and harder to build direction.
Okay, let's go on to the final scenario here, scenario D, which we're calling neighborhood infill. In this scenario, downtown and neighboring districts experience the majority of the region's employment growth, but housing growth is split between existing residential neighborhoods and urban activity centers and corridors. By allowing more compact housing types such as, and we'll amend some of this language to be a little more clear because you already allow accessory dwelling units and duplexes, but we'll specify that it's actually more than that. This scenario seeks to create additional options and possibilities for housing available at lower price points in neighborhoods throughout the region. You can see the established neighborhoods are popping up a little bit more in this concept map. And so in terms of where the action is, we don't go over 6 stories in downtown. We just see kind of the status quo of what's been built in the last real estate cycle. And we see more compact housing types in suburban activity centers. So these are where it's possible, there would be some rethinking of how dense those areas could be. There'd be a greater focus on missing middle housing. Minimal change in the rural activity centers, similar to scenario C. And in established neighborhoods, there'd be more compact housing types up to potentially quadplexes or even more. And that's something we want to talk about. But first, just rounding out the transportation investments, this scenario would also have the upward investment package. So same as scenario C. And similar to scenario C, it would receive the first priority active transportation master plan improvements and the lesser priority active transportation master plan improvements serving East Flagstaff and central neighborhoods. So prioritizing those improvements outside of downtown, but in those sort of central neighborhoods. And in terms of housing mix, it has the most attached housing of any scenario. So less multifamily than scenario C, same split of single family. So similar to the question that we were just discussing about how tall should the taller buildings be in scenario C, I wanted to ask how dense do we think middle housing could be in this scenario? And for those who aren't familiar with the concept, middle housing refers to this type of housing that most American cities were really good at building until about the 1950s, when we really pivoted into building detached single family homes. So they're everything from a duplex up to and beyond a 6, 7, 8 unit small apartment building. And so there aren't very many of those that get built nowadays. Many cities zoning precludes a lot of those housing types. And so the idea here is that this scenario would try to fully explore what not only allowing those, but also enabling those to happen by maybe restructuring impact fees, reducing parking requirements, reducing lot coverage requirements, really trying to incentivize this type of housing, even limiting the size of detached single family homes, which is something that some cities are exploring in an effort to make middle housing more attractive to developers to build. So this is really the middle housing scenario is one way to look at it. So what do you all think about how far that should go in this scenario? And there's a comment from Tyler. Not sure how this impacts the analysis, but I strongly suspect the state legislature will pass a preemption bill within the next decade, they require cities to legalize these types of housing in traditionally single-family neighborhoods. And there was an attempt, right, last year, did not pass, but would have potentially forced jurisdictions to do some flavor of that. What went wrong in the 1950s, I think we really incentivized home ownership, and it was a much easier way to get people into home ownership to build one house on one piece of land than to try to do it with multiple units on one piece of land. Although the condoization of these units really does provide an option for home ownership in middle housing. But yeah, we really pivoted into the single family home and didn't stop. But starting to, I think the latest, this is really in the weeds, but the latest new home starts seem to indicate that multifamily housing, for the first time in a long time, is gaining ground against single family new home construction.
I think what Tyler said, Steiny, is important because, we're exploring these ideas because they're out there and they're happening. Likewise, what would it mean if, fourplexes were by state statute allowed in every single family zone? One of the things that the bill that was introduced last time didn't do, and I wonder what the group thinks of this, is it didn't override covenants of the single family subsidized neighborhoods with HOAs. It would only have applied to our basically pre-HOA or defunct HOA neighborhoods. So should we test that idea everywhere? Like Country Club starts getting fourplexes and so does Sunnyside, or do we test it basically more conservatively in that it's only in those places without a functional HOA? I'd like to hear some feedback on what gets tested here, because I think it could make a difference too. And I could see both of those scenarios being something that the legislature sort of puts in our lap in the next decade or two.
I struggle to see a bill that comes through that has that kind of impact on HOAs. They have, short of the realtors at the state level, they're kind of one of the more powerful lobbying groups. So given how hard this legislation has been to get through, it seems like, that's a battle that they're unlikely to be willing to fight.
Thanks, David. Other thoughts on that from folks and thinking about whether that seems realistic? Because I think that decision, I think by itself will definitely change what kind of impacts we see from scenario D, the assumption we make about which neighborhoods are getting infill.
Hi, y'all. This is Kim. I think that the scenario is good and it is feasible, but I'm more concerned of the not in my backyard mentality in the more affluent neighborhoods. So we want to see a solution to the problem. Speaking in general terms, people want to see a solution to the problem, but not always in their backyard.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, that's a good comment. And this scenario, it forces people to consider that possibility. And so if there's a person who wants to see the city grow in a more compact way and wants to see us meet our carbon neutrality goals, the scenario C and D set up a choice. You can push all the density into the downtown and be comfortable with taller buildings, or it can come to you. Not at that level of intensity, but you're going to sort of see some change maybe in your neighborhood.
Stephanie unmuted for a second. Did you have something to add?
I have a question. Does this mean that the city would alter the zoning restrictions? It doesn't necessarily mean that it would happen. right? Because there would have to be land available or plots available to even develop this into those. I'm thinking of kind of the question or the comment on the not in my backyard. Well, if your backyard doesn't have availability to even do that, is it even feasible? Am I understanding this correctly?
Right. I
No,
mean,
I
these
think,
are, oh, go ahead,
go
Sarah.
ahead, Steiny.
Well, these scenarios are meant to test a potential outcome. And if people like it, it tells policymakers that they should adopt policies that get us closer to that outcome. And so it doesn't force anyone to do anything. But if the public comes out and says, yeah, we actually like the way this looks, we like the idea that this is illustrating for us, then the city can take steps to not, again, ensure the outcome will happen, but make sure that policies they have in place and the way they prioritize spending public dollars gets us closer to that outcome. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of the way I think about it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I kind of think that the question the scenario is answering is, what if we time jumped 20 years forward and the community looked like this? It doesn't really answer the in-between question of how would we write policies that get us from where we are today to get there? It just says, what if we jumped and we were there? And then what would the community look like? And then the policy translation step, which is the part we would do after scenario choosing, is where we go back in and start going, okay, to get from here to there, these are the policies and the phases of that the community wants us to work through.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful framework. I appreciate that.
Looks like Genevieve has a comment.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to jump in, Sarah, on your original question about, do we include neighborhoods that have HOAs in the kind of densification of established neighborhoods? And I don't have an answer to that, but I just think something to think about is that, I think Kim mentioned too, NIMBYism in potentially more affluent neighborhoods. And a lot of the ones that have HOAs are newer and probably tend to be more upper middle class or higher income levels. So, and they're not necessarily in the center of the city or even in kind of between the center and some of the neighborhoods north of Route 66, kind of by Mount Eldon, that are a little bit more established. So it would have a pretty big impact in terms of where densification would actually happen, because I think in both scenario D and C, if we excluded the neighborhoods with CC&Rs that prohibited more densification, they would still concentrate that densification in those neighborhoods. It'd probably just be more in scenario D. And so then I think just another kind of thing to think about too is the densification in this one talks about ADUs, duplexes, triplexes, quads, etc. And there may be some nuance too. I don't know how deep we want to get into like what different CC&Rs allow, but I know some allow ADUs, for example, but they don't allow duplexes. So I don't know really how much that helps, but I do think that whatever the decision is, whether we include those neighborhoods or not, it will have a big impact on where that densification happens.
Yeah, and
that's a really
another
good point.
Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. We keep jumping at the same time.
know.
I was just going to say that's a really good point, that even if we were to release all the regulations, the social pressures could lead to a similar result. So I had not thought of that, and I think that's worth taking into consideration. Kim, I think, was going to unmute too, I saw.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify that when I use not in my backyard mentality, colloquially, I mean that it's not an we can't mentality, it's a we won't mentality. So if it's not a feasible solution for a particular neighborhood, I don't consider it a not in my backyard mentality.
Another consideration related to some of the things I'm hearing is the potential for displacement in both scenarios C and D. Especially in scenario D, if you are very limited in the places where these things can be applied, then I'm going to just make a wild guess here that the neighborhoods that have established CCNRs that protect the single family character of those neighborhoods are going to be on the, in general, higher income neighborhoods. Would I be incorrect about that? Not hearing anyone. Not hearing anyone pushing back too
I think
much on
you're
that.
correct about that. They're generally in Flagstaff places that were built after the or in the early 90s or later. So they're the newer housing stock.
Yeah.
You consider 30 years new.
So, you know, it's going to be really important to consider how these scenarios perform in terms of their potential to displace. Because if we are basically locked out of any change in areas that are more affluent, that change is probably going to be more apparent in places where the housing stock is older, where maybe homeowners are less stable in terms of their financial situation and more susceptible to displacement. And so it's a question of whether we want to show that in a scenario or assume that in a scenario we solve for the problem of geographic concentration of development activity, right? So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. It looks like Tyler has a comment.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm a little bit behind on the conversation. This is about what we were talking about before displacement. I was just going to echo Kim's comment that, yeah, CCRs do feel like a tool that mostly wealthier neighborhoods use to push development pressure into lower income neighborhoods. But also, if the CCNRs are going to block this multifamily or this missing middle infill housing anyways, then why should the city be sweating over also maintaining that via zoning?
So stated another way, Tyler, if I'm understanding correctly, we shouldn't be hung up with anything that's in this scenario because, well, I guess if I'm understanding correctly, you support exploring these changes in areas that aren't covered by CCNRs because it just seems like a logical thing to do. There's no reason to maintain that same single family status quo or to protect it when there isn't a CCNR that's forcing you to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And if the neighborhood is going to enforce it via CCR anyways, then why should the city have a second barrier to it via zoning?
I see. So if this scenario, if we're not touching areas that have these covenants that restrict multifamily and middle housing, how do we present this scenario in a way, or how could this scenario happen in a way that doesn't displace a ton of vulnerable residents? Does anyone have any ideas of what that could look like?
I think there's an economic basis to the lack of sort of the fourplex to 6-8 unit kind of developments as well. In that you've moved into either large single family subdivisions, right, that are kind of 40 acres or so at a time is what's necessary to really make those viable. Or apartment projects, even if they're low rise, are spread across a larger area. So you've really got to push pretty hard to be able to get that missing middle stuff back by effectively not allowing anything else, right? So if that's the only thing that you can build in a certain zone, then the additional cost of doing that versus doing two of the other things ends up coming off of the land value, as opposed to coming out of the developer's pocket, in which case they don't actually do it.
And that was the case, just an example I can offer is from the city of Portland, Oregon. They limited the size of single family homes in the same zones where they enabled middle housing and allowed those units to become larger, those buildings to become larger. So in that way, you couldn't build the same very large single family home you used to. And so developers decided that middle housing made more sense to them given that restriction. But I don't think that gets necessarily at the anti-displacement question. I think we're going to have to continue this discussion around, in particular, this scenario, because from what I'm hearing, allowing new housing types in only certain neighborhoods, and when those neighborhoods are probably neighborhoods with residents that are more vulnerable to displacement, that's a recipe potentially for accelerated displacement. So thinking about how we message that, if there are other policies that we can say are being implemented alongside this so that it doesn't result in a lot of displacement. I think one of the pieces of the story that's very important is that middle housing, that there's probably already displacement happening, for one, and the things that are being replaced in that displacement are single family homes, probably, that are very expensive. And so, at least in this scenario, the new units are smaller and more affordable. So that's a positive. But it's complicated, and we're going to have to be really sensitive in the way that we share this information. Any other comments about scenario D that anyone wants to get out there?
Hey, Alex, this is Genevieve. Just, I don't know how deep in depth is appropriate right now to go into this, but I do think some research into how restrictive the CCNRs of some different neighborhoods actually are would be really helpful, because we're making some assumptions that they're really restrictive, and that's probably generally true, but it might not be all the way true. So it might not result in this, that only the densification happens in established neighborhoods and nothing in the neighborhoods from the 90s and later. There may be a little bit more nuance to that and could have a big impact on what this scenario looks like. So again, just if that's possible, I think that would really help and maybe answer some of those questions. Is this being concentrated? Where is this being concentrated? Is this assumption actually accurate? Just because this is really important to be able to understand. So a little bit more research into what the CCNRs actually say may be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're making a lot of assumptions here on minimal information. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Devonna. Can I also say though that living in a neighborhood with CCNRs, they don't restrict ADUs, but the setback requirements essentially do. Like, so there's ways around saying out loud we don't like them that effectively ban them. So if you look at what they say, but you can also have a nuanced, really clear look at what they do in practicality, that would be helpful. Because if you just looked at mine, you'd see that it's allowed and you'd be like, that's great. And then when it's a 15-foot setback from your property line, you've used up your entire backyard.
That's a good point. Yeah, so it's quite a bit of research that would need to happen. You can't just look at sort of the skim the high level points of the CCNR. You have to actually dig in and figure out if it's actually feasible to do it. Paul asks, what if a scenario encourages local smaller development rather than larger development? Well, I think that's part of what we're showing in scenario C versus scenario D. I don't know if you're speaking specifically here to the size of the developer or the size of the building, but in any case, residents have development around them without being displaced. Certainly, yeah. I mean, we'll have to see how it shakes out in each of the scenarios, but there's certainly a possibility that there's enough vacant land or underutilized commercial land, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that we can fit all of the growth in without too much redevelopment of existing single family homes. Okay, I'm gonna move into the last section here in the interest of time, just comparing the scenarios to one another. This is sort of our final summary of the 4 scenarios. So comparing the location of growth in all 4 scenarios. One of the really important concepts of modeling these scenarios is that they all need to be reasonably different from one another to make a meaningful story out of this. And so we like to compare them all side by side to make sure that they're looking reasonably different. And this is all still pretty conceptual, right? This is sort of a set of targets we're shooting for. But in scenario A, which is actually based on the draft that we've produced, it's sort of an even split between suburban and urban activity centers. In scenario B, we've got growth happening mostly in suburban activity centers. In scenario C, it's mostly urban activity centers. And in scenario D, it's still mostly those urban activity centers, but there is about a quarter of the growth that's happening in existing neighborhoods. So that's the way that they compare to one another, and that's how we ensure that they do produce meaningfully different outcomes. Looks like Melissa has a comment. It seems like painting can still occur in neighborhoods with CC&Rs to demonstrate neighborhood infill, and supported by specific policies would need to be very specific about avoiding displacement. Yeah, I mean, we could choose to go that route, Melissa, that we say, things can happen, laws can change. So as Sarah mentioned, HOAs can dissolve, state statute can preempt all of that. So we could choose to just paint them anyway. And yeah, I agree. We'd need to be very specific about avoiding displacement. So in terms of regional transportation investments, just to summarize here, the scenario A is all the way on the onward side, which is the sort of status quo, fully funded version of regional investments. Scenario B is that plus a little bit, a few of the upward projects supporting suburban activity centers. And then scenarios C and D, because they are more compact, the idea is that we will have potentially more resources to go around to some of these areas. And so we can get closer to the upward transportation package. And then in terms of the housing summary, again, to compare all of them, scenario A is 70% single family, scenario B is 65%, and scenario C and D are 55%. And then as we talked about before, the most multifamilies happening in scenario C, the most attached housing happening in scenario D. So we just covered a summary of all of the scenario narratives, and then a comparison of the location of growth by scenario, the regional transportation investments by scenario, and the housing mix by scenario. Are these feeling, I mean, I'll just kind of go back to this slide for lack of a better summary slide. Are these feeling like we're hitting a broad enough spectrum of potential outcomes? Are we feeling like we're missing anything from the scenarios that we've presented to you today?
One question, this is Jenny, the city. One question that I had to answer that question is, what's our historic development, right? Like, I think I've seen numbers that, half of our folks are, renters and like how much historically have we had of multifamily housing, right? Because I still look at, development of, single family housing as 55%. Still really high, right? And so I think that would be my question of like, what has historic development been? And I don't know, that's still deeply high, I think. And I know a lot of people want single family housing, but I think, in terms of realities of what Flagstaff looks like, I wonder if that might need to go lower. I'm not sure.
So we looked at development back to 2002 when we created the business as usual scenario. and tried to match the outcome roughly to that. So scenario A is that historic growth, historic back to, 20 some odd years in terms of growth. So we're sort of pivoting off of that. We don't want to suggest something that is wildly different from what the market's been producing, but a swing of from 70% down to 55% is pretty substantial. But I could see, if other folks are feeling similarly, I could see maybe looking at some of your peer cities to see what they've been able to achieve. Boulder might be a good example. Maybe Bozeman, maybe Missoula, and just looking at what they've been able to achieve, just so that we make sure we're not putting something out there that's too pie in the sky, right? So we can take a look at
That's
that and maybe
helpful.
consider it for scenario C or scenario D.
Sure. And just knowing, right, that essentially BAU is kind of mimicking the last 20 years makes a lot of sense. So that was my main question. So I appreciate it. I do think the peer city comparison would be interesting too.
Other comments? Go ahead, Julie.
I think it would be great to shift the needle. I think it's ambitious. I feel like sometimes, the motto is more like grudgingly growing, because we can come up with all of these reasons why we can't, won't, shouldn't, in any one of these scenarios, other than the business as usual scenario. I'm wondering when we can get to the point as a community to be more open to growth and excited about growth, and more welcoming to growth, perhaps by demonstrating these scenarios B, C, and D, we can start changing that narrative a little bit. But it's really hard, and I think that's why we have been kind of stagnant in the BAU in the last 20 years.
Roxana?
I just want to jump on what Julie would just said in terms of not necessarily asking what we're excited about, but what can we live with, especially within the context of the pros and cons for each scenario. And being able to compare each scenario to peer cities would be really helpful. It gives the visual, gives background, gives lessons learned in their experiences that could really help put these into context and help us decide as a community what can we live with from all these that is worth living with the cons for the pros that it comes with.
Tyler asked the question, allowing denser land uses doesn't preclude single-family home development if that's what consumers overwhelmingly prefer, correct? Yeah, I think that's right to an extent. The business as usual scenario, half of the single-family homes are on lots larger than an acre or larger. And so what's in that 70% really matters. In scenario B and to maybe a greater extent C and D, the composition of those single family homes and how dense they are is going to change dramatically. So it's not necessarily that just because you see 70 to 65 that means it's a similar density. It's going to be different. And looking at the historic lot pattern in Flagstaff, it can be quite different, down to 3,000-4,000 square feet, maybe even less in some cases per lot, and that gets you up into a density of 8, almost 10 units an acre. So you can get some decent density out of single family. Other questions, comments?
Maybe that's a question for the group, is to see, maybe that's scenario D, let's say. I'm just saying something about it. Not, this isn't a final proposal, was doing denser single family too. Is that a good, like that I'm trying to articulate something that's coming off the top of my head, that it really incentivized denser development in new neighborhoods, even if it was still in the single family home category. Is that something we should put as one of our assumptions here? Say like, yeah, we're letting quads where there's no HOAs, but in new neighborhoods, we're starting to push them over the number the transit agency has given us in the past is that neighborhoods that support transit really have to be greater than 7 dwelling units per acre. And if they're 10, it's even better. So do we start saying, could we push new neighborhoods over 10 dwelling units per acre with a single family style of housing, attached, not, we can play with that a little bit. Is that a piece that maybe the neighborhood infill scenario should include and that we should kind of call out? That's just me reflecting, trying to come up with an idea that reflects back what we're hearing.
Or even
Sarah-
scenario B.
Sarah, do you think
True.
that that would come at the expense of resource protection? I mean, is that how we accomplish it?
We had originally today proposed that we keep resource protection very high for all scenarios based on the community feedback we've got, but that is open for the tag to discuss, I think. Wouldn't you say, Steiny?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the margins, there will be some differences between these scenarios, especially in scenarios A and B versus C and D, just by their nature of where growth is happening. But none of these scenarios propose wild expansion into areas that aren't currently served by infrastructure. So hopefully there's not too much compromise there.
I guess in terms of scenario B, places where we feasibly believe we could expand infrastructure, because that
Fair.
one's about new communities. Yeah. Those are great
Okay,
questions, though. That's why you guys are
Sorry.
on the tag, so keep it coming.
2 comments. Sarah, I think that the very simple answer to your question is no. I think we've kind of maxed out what you can achieve with single family zoning, right? I mean, we allow 6,000 square foot lots currently, right? So under the business as usual scenario, we really are getting up. We're already at the maximum density that you can pull off for single family. And then as a follow up, I think that was Julie's comment. I think it'd be really interesting to see once you guys actually do the scenarios. Hopefully you're getting into this level of detail that with the resource protection standards, what are you able to hit in terms of density? Because it's definitely, my experience, I understand the experience of other developers in town that, for instance, in the traditional neighborhood community plans, it's borderline whether you can hit the minimum densities required in those plans while also meeting the resource protection standards for tree and slope protection.
I think it's important to describe those too, so that folks know when we talk about resource protection, yeah, we're talking about tree canopy. So on any commercial project and any residential project, there is a certain percentage of tree canopy that has to be maintained, which means no disturbance under the canopy of a tree based on the size of the tree and, certain slope thresholds. And so to be clear about that, so it's not that when we're talking about resource protection, there's a concern that, for example, we can suddenly develop in floodplains. I think, being specific to trees and slopes.
So let me ask David and Julie and anyone else who's kind of on the development side, where and how should we test tree and slope reductions as a possibility in this set of scenarios? Where would you want to see us test that idea? Because I come from a natural resource background, and the trees, while great, we are saving them for anthropomorphic reasons in a lot of cases, because there's some very risk sensitive ecosystems in and around Flagstaff, we don't protect at all, and we very heavily protect trees. So that's worth, I think there is some ability to have conversations in the regional plan of, should we be protecting mountain meadows and the rare plants in them because of their climate change risk? And, the reports that have come out of ASU and U of A about that. So, that doesn't say we're not valuing resources, but what if we reprioritized how we are valuing resources in a given scenario? Is that something we test through scenario planning, or we do later through policy conversations about how we arrive? Steiny, Rachel, anybody chime in?
I will. I know I'm not Steiny or Rachel, but Julie can. I think that's great, Sarah. And I think, is there a way to look at this in, let's say, scenario B? Can you actually shift the needle on more towards what Jenny was speaking about with changes to resource protection? And I think as far as resource protection, it's looked at as on a subdivision level. So I'm thinking about the subdivision applications that are coming into the city of Flagstaff for some very significant development in greenfield areas right now. What does that look like through the platting and development process, and how does that change how that area develops?
Thanks, Julie. This is Genevieve. Just to add, I think that goes back to the connection with the ongoing project to analyze the development codes. I think that testing out these ideas in the scenario planning is really helpful for thinking about where development codes can go. So I definitely support looking at different options just in general so that we can get that information and use that to help as we evaluate the codes.
Okay, well, that's a lot of really useful information. Thanks everyone for sharing that. I want to make sure we have time to talk next steps before we wrap up. So a few upcoming things to be aware of. As I mentioned before, we are going to be doing a workshop with city and county staff to further ground truth our scenario assumptions, to get at some of those questions around CCNRs and resource protection that came up today. So trust that there will be a lens of how reasonable are these assumptions that comes into this from folks who know these things backwards and forwards. Once we have that, then we're going to be modeling these scenarios using our urban footprint tool. We're also going to be working with MetroPlan to run these scenarios through their travel demand model to get some more nuanced assumptions on travel, and also to test out some of those transportation improvements that we talked about. And when we come back to you in the next tag meeting is, we should have draft scenario modeling results in late September. So we'll be able to review what came out of these scenarios and start to get your feedback on how we message this to the public. And then at some point in the fall, we haven't settled on exact dates, will be a series of scenario choosing workshops where the public will weigh in on the aspects of each scenario that they like best. And from there, not on the slide today, but just to give you a sense of where we go in 2024, we start in the fall and really ramp up in 2024 to talking about the actual policies that should be in the regional plan update to support the scenario that the public supported in the scenario choosing workshops. So that's all upcoming. So look forward to that. And we will send you information on dates and probably a doodle as late September gets closer. So with that, I will hand it back to Sarah if you have any other final things you want to share with the group, and then we can wrap up.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank everybody for a really great conversation today. I appreciate very much how much this group has been willing to question some status quo assumptions as we're developing scenarios so that we can learn, because that is completely the point of exploratory scenario planning, is to ask our what ifs and try and get an understanding and learn what they could mean for the community. And I think that we have an opportunity here to tell these stories in a way that help really engage the community in a very different dialogue about our future and who we are and what we hope to become. So I really value everyone's time. I'm looking forward to staff and Cascadia partners getting you a draft to look at in terms of our modeling results and what we end up modeling, and to get ready for these fall workshops. I think they'll be very, very busy. The only other update I have for the group is that the regional plan, as you know, has usually had a committee that helps with that policy translation that Steiny discussed. And I have forwarded a staff report and all of the letters of interest from individuals that were nominated by our elected officials for that committee. And so I'm looking forward to also, around the time we're getting to scenario choosing workshops, that committee will be formed, and they'll kind of pick up where you all have left off. So then my last ask for the group is, can everyone email me an address and most up-to-date contact information for tag members, just for my own personal ability to make sure everyone who participates gets a thank you from me and from the city. So I'll put that in there, and I will send a reminder of that by email. That's all I have.
All right. Yep. Share your address so you can get your own Barbie meme postcard. And yeah, again, thank you for your time today. Super helpful. And we will be in touch soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.